Arte contemporáneo. Se vende a las galerías de arte ricas y exclusivas. ¿Pero qué ha hecho por nosotros? ¿Ha influido en la ropa que llevamos? ¿En los edificios donde vivimos? ¿En los coches que conducimos? ¿En los libros que leemos a nuestros hijos? ¿O en la manera en que pensamos? Mi nombre es Albert y me dedico a escribir sobre arte. En esta serie de reportajes investigaré la vida y la obra de 4 titanes del siglo XX: Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dalí y Andy Warhol. Los 4 cambiaron su mundo, pero ¿cómo nos han cambiado a nosotros? Esta semana, Dalí. Maestros del arte contemporáneo, Dalí. Salvador Dalí es el showman del arte del siglo XX. Nació con un travieso sentido del humor. Perfeccionó nuestra comprensión del absurdo enseñándonos que cualquier cosa es posible. Y en sus coloridos cuadros surrealistas dio vida a extraordinarios mundos oníricos. Dalí conocerá el significado del surrealismo gracias a la esencia consciente de lo bizarro y de lo inesperado que subyace en lo irracional. Y nosotros conocemos este significado gracias a Dalí. Dalí comercializó el surrealismo. Por su excéntrica apariencia y por sus travesuras absurdas, muchos lo tacharon de payaso, de personaje sediento de autobombo. Así pues, ¿el arte que creó fue tan importante? ¿Ha cambiado el mundo en el que vivimos? Si nombras a Dalí hoy en día, la mayoría de las personas, aparte de pensar en su gran bigote, piensan en los relojes derretidos. Creo que la persistencia de la memoria es la pintura más famosa de Dalí. Ha sido reproducida y parodiada en todas partes. La pintura original está en Nueva York, en el Museo de Arte Moderno, por lo que es allí al primer lugar al que me dirijo. Aquí la tenemos. Pero no os dejéis engañar por el tamaño. Estamos hablando de 24 por 33 centímetros de dinamita daliniana que explota con ideas sobre el tiempo, los sueños y las fantasías y los miedos más íntimos. Casi 80 años después de que lo pintara, todavía hay algo en esta pintura que nos atrapa. Tiene el extraño toque etéreo de un sueño, pero de un sueño inquietante y difícil de olvidar. Es como si Dalí hubiera cogido nuestras inquietudes intangibles sobre el paso del tiempo y sobre la mortalidad y las hubiera cristalizado con pintura. ¿Qué es lo que la hace tan atractiva? Tal vez es porque Dalí pinta mundos imposibles de una forma tan realista que parecen reales, pero de alguna manera lo son. Porque los paisajes de Dalí están inspirados en un lugar que él amaba, en la dramática costa del noroeste de España. Dalí nació a más de 30 kilómetros tierra adentro en el año 1904. Su padre, un rico abogado, era un estricto disciplinario, mientras que su madre lo malcriaba. Pero fue Felipa la primera que apostó por el arte de Dalí. Posiblemente sus recuerdos de infancia, sus sueños y sus deseos ocupen tanto su mente que saturan casi todas sus últimas pinturas. Dalí dijo una vez: yo he sido concebido en estas rocas. Aquí he cincelado mi personalidad. Mi personalidad no se puede separar de este cielo, de este mar, de estas rocas. Asentado en esta costa rocosa está el pueblo de Cadaqués. La familia de Dalí solía pasar las vacaciones aquí. Y aquí es donde me voy a encontrar con el biógrafo de Dalí, Ian.
Dalí estaba muy enamorado de este lugar y puedo entender por qué. Es realmente mágico.
Hábleme de la familia de Dalí.
Pues tenía una familia tremenda. Mira, por ejemplo, en esta foto, que fue tomada más o menos por aquí, tenemos a Dalí sentado ahí con probablemente 5 o 6 años.
Me encanta el hecho de que se sitúa a sí mismo justamente en el centro.
Dalí siempre tiene que estar en el centro de todas las cosas.
¿Cómo de importante es entender este lugar para concebir sus últimas obras?
Es realmente vital. En todos sus primeros dibujos, en las primeras pinturas, los escorzos de la iglesia, diría que todo lo de aquí, la gente, las casas, la arquitectura, las barcas, Sin Cadaqués no hay Dalí, tan simple y directo como eso. Creo que Dalí se identifica totalmente con este paisaje.
Las pinturas que Dalí hizo de Cadaqués durante su infancia muestran su talento natural. Pintó esta cuando tan solo tenía 15 años.
Podía pintar desde el día en que nació. Lo tenía en la sangre. Por eso se consideró un genio desde el primer día. Lo podía hacer. Cuando pinta un pato, es un pato. Si pinta un cisne, es un cisne, decía su madre. Esparció la pintura sobre el lienzo y se dio cuenta de que había nacido con ese don.
Por sus cálidas pinturas de la adolescencia, es difícil deducir que tuvo una infancia perturbadora. Solo años después, sus inquietudes se reflejarán en su obra. El retablo es abrumador.
Es inquietante.
Debió de influir a Dalí de pequeño, ¿no crees?
Desde luego, sí, lo cierto es que este tipo de obras te hipnotizan.
Muchas de las últimas pinturas de Dalí, sus grandes obras maestras, son realmente apabullantes, inquietantes. Hay un lado más oscuro de Dalí que empieza a emerger aquí, ¿no?
Desde luego que existe ese lado más oscuro. Esas playas desiertas con tan apenas personas, con siluetas en la distancia, siempre solo. Creo que se sentía muy solo, nervioso, y que era muy tímido. Y más tarde vino su preocupación por su madre. Tiene mucho apego a su madre, pero esta no se encuentra bien, y finalmente muere cuando él es todavía joven. Y esto es una pérdida terrible. Entonces él se queda solo con su padre, que es un hombre muy violento. Dalí tiene muchas discusiones con él. Lo admira, le gustaría ser como él, pero siempre están discutiendo.
Cuando Dalí tenía 18 años, se fue a Madrid a estudiar Bellas Artes. Aquí empezó a lidiar con su gran timidez, desarrollando una nueva y excéntrica personalidad.
His student art displayed outstanding technical ability, and Dalí certainly knew it. His shyness was transformed into unbridled self-belief. He was actually expelled for making the outrageous statement that none of his teachers was good enough to examine his work. Going to Madrid was the first step in the young Salvador becoming Dalí. Dalí was in his early 20s when he first heard about a group of experimental artists in Paris who were creating strange, fantastical work. So strange, in fact, that a new word had to be invented to describe their art. Surreal. Discovering surrealism would change Dalí's life. So what was surrealism? Well, it started out as a literary and artistic movement that was launched by this man, who is the French poet André Breton, in 1924. And it began really as a revolutionary response to the devastations of the First World War, and also it was inspired by the psychoanalytical theories of the great Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that all of us have got this inner unconscious world in which our emotional and sexual feelings are repressed, and that the only way to express ourselves is to release these emotions, but without censoring what comes out. And the Surrealists were fascinated by the bizarre, quickly decided that they needed to explore this new forbidden landscape of the unconscious mind. Someone like Giorgio de Chirico created strange and haunting landscapes in which these odd, oversized objects that really don't belong together dominate the canvas. A little bit later, the Belgian artist René Magritte started painting conventional, bowler-hatted businessmen pouring out the sky. Putting it all up together, suddenly you realize why the young Dalí instinctively knew that surrealism was the artistic movement for him. He could express himself with impunity and put onto the canvas all of his inner desires, fears, obsessions, and anxieties. Like here, in one of his earliest surrealist paintings, Honey is Sweeter Than Blood. The barren shore of Cadaqués is scattered with strange objects that represent his childhood and adult anxieties. Inspired by Freud's ideas, he's liberating his unconscious obsessions through his art. Death and sex were clearly on the 23-year-old Dalí's mind. To extract these strange visions from his deepest psyche,
Dali developed a technique that he called the paranoid critical method, based on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theories. I haven't a clue what Dali meant by this, so I'm on my way to meet psychoanalyst Darian Leader in the hope he can explain. We're meeting at the house in North London where Freud lived after escaping Nazi-occupied Austria. Dali himself visited here in 1938 to pay his dues to the great man.
So this is Freud's study.
This is actually the study?
It is indeed.
This is the couch?
This is the Freud's original couch, indeed.
I've heard a lot about this quite complicated term, the paranoid critical method. What does it mean?
I think the main thing of interest is the notion of paranoia. This is what Dali was really interested in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and then beyond. He saw paranoia as an essential mechanism in the construction of reality, so that when we see, let's say, some rocks or a cliff, we could say that's just some rocks or a cliff, but we could also see in it the human form, perhaps even something looking at us, a big pair of eyes, exactly what would be classified as a paranoid delusion. Dali, in a sense, explores and develops this idea in his painting. So, for example, here, seen from one angle, we have a scene perhaps in a desert or on a beach, a number of figures in front of a dwelling with some trees behind it. Then turn it and we see fairly clearly a human face. Now, what's the correct way to interpret the image? Dali's saying that both of those ways of reading the visual data give us different answers, exactly the kind of emphasis on double images that Dali was so fascinated in. Dali's arguing we interpret the visual data that we're receiving, and we can interpret it in different ways, and that there's a fundamental question about how we interpret the world around us.
So Dali's idea is a bit like that game we play as kids, where you gaze at clouds and let your imagination run wild, perceiving animals, objects and faces in the random shapes. But instead of clouds, Dali would head out to the rocks near Cadaqués, armed with his sketchbook, to let an alternative reality suggest itself to him. Local fisherman Moses, who met Dali when he was a boy, is familiar with the artist's old haunts.
These rocks appear in so many of his paintings, and it is amazing just being a few meters away from them, because suddenly it feels like we're floating in the middle of one of his landscapes.
Exactly.
Do you find when you're fishing, you pass these rocks and you see all sorts of things?
Oh yeah, and it depends on the light, on the weather, and yeah, you get really inspired by these rocks. Look at the camel.
I can, what, there with the, yeah, right. It looks like he's just squatted down in the middle of the desert.
Exactly. And then further down, now there's a rhinoceros up there.
Ah, I love the rhinoceros. Dali was obsessed with rhinos.
Yeah, that's why.
I thought the guy was a little bit nuts and that you'd just see things in the rocks which maybe other people couldn't see.
Yeah, but you
But genuinely,
yeah,
that looks like a rhino leaping up the rocks.
exactly.
And the camel that's squatted down. I'm trying to match this up to the landscape, but I'm having...
There's one very famous Dali picture that I'm told is based on a specific outcrop. The picture is the extraordinarily named The Great Masturbator, and it was inspired by a rock that, to Dali at least, suggested a great face lying nose down.
Okay. They're all fantastical shapes.
Yeah.
I feel a bit like I'm approaching Skull Island or something. Is this it? This is the one?
This is it.
This is the one. Let's just get a better angle. Hang on. Ah, I'm starting to recognise it. There's his nose. Massive nose. Face down.
Exactly.
This is it. Just looks like a piece of bone which has been dropped here. Wow.
But it looks much better from the other side.
This is genuinely, this is the rock. You can see it's exactly the same shape.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, there's a bit of rock that goes up there which corresponds to this part of the painting, which is above.
Today, the original hangs in Madrid's Reina Sofia gallery. Amazingly, in that one rock, Dali's imagination didn't just see a face on its nose, but a disturbing array of his own sexual desires, insecurities, and phobias.
Here, you can see that everything coalesces, comes together. It's utterly surreal, but it's also uniquely Dali. And it gives a very, very complex, fraught vision of Dali's mind at the time. out of his head, in this very fluid, dreamlike way, comes this explosion of imagery. In it, he put all of his obsessions, phobias, anxieties. Clamped onto the mouth of the self-portrait is a grasshopper. He was so scared of locusts as a child, and suddenly here it is, right rammed up against his face. And over on this side, you have this, well, it's not really suggestive, it's quite explicit, kind of petrified, rather beautiful woman's face, looking at the nether regions of a bloke, which is standing nearby. And beneath it, almost like a parody of this part, is the lion's face, but with his tongue really lewdly lolling out and standing up on end. But around it are these fangs, which are saying, maybe all is not that well in the bedroom. And if you look right down here, you see this figure in the distance, and his long shadow leads you right to the horizon where, and it's so tiny. That's probably a memory of Dali with his mother or his father walking on the beach at Cadaqués. And I love that sense of complete distortions of scale, with a real clarity, a luminosity that, as a picture, works beautifully. This just holds together.
In 1929, Dali took the imagery he'd dreamt up for his paintings and reworked them into a film, The Extraordinary Un Chien Andalou, which he made with his art school friend and filmmaker, Luis Buñuel. An astonishingly weird nightmare of irrational and gruesome images, combined with absurd humour, it was a landmark moment in both the history of surrealism and cinema.
On the evening of the premiere, Dali and Buñuel supposedly carried stones in their pockets, just in case the crowd reacted badly and things got really out of hand. But it was a triumph. Andre Breton was amazed. He wrote, "With Dali, it is perhaps for the first time that our mental windows have been opened wide." Dali may have been a latecomer to the movement, but the surrealists quickly recognised that this provocative young talent was their new champion.
One of surrealism's greatest legacies has been in film and television, and particularly in comedy. Today's comedians, such as the League of Gentlemen or the Mighty Boosh, like Dali, combine the absurd with the macabre, the profound with the ridiculous. So how much does the comedian Noel Fielding, who stars in the Mighty Boosh, owe to Dali?
I think with surrealism, it's what me and Julian call like a snot bubble laugh, which is like where you laugh because you can't stop yourself laughing because it's so absurd. You don't sort of... Because there's two types of laugh. You watch Roy Bremner or something, it's good or whatever, but you sort of go, oh yeah, that's good, yeah. And you go, but then there's a sort of laugh, hopefully you get out of our show, or Vic Reed's show, which is like, where you just go, that's actually ridiculous. And you just sort of can't stop yourself laughing because it's just your brain... The absurdity of it has made your brain slightly implode. I don't want to do comedy that people could do themselves, you know. For me, that's the criteria, and that's what I like about Dali. He has ideas that I don't think, when you're walking around a museum, you think you could have had yourself. I just like the ideas. First time I saw a sort of burning giraffe, like a giraffe on fire. It's in the back of one of the paintings, I can't remember which one it is, but it's not even very big. It's just in the corner. I just thought, that's amazing. I have to sort of know more about this person.
If you had to pinpoint what you find particularly funny about Dali, what would it be?
He's like a sort of... He's sort of like a make-believe character, isn't he? He turned everything upside down. He's committed, I think, to being a surrealist and to getting a reaction. And I think that makes him authentic, and I think that only good comedy is authentic.
In the summer of 1929, basking in his success within the surrealist camp, Dali returned to Cadaqués,
where a major change was about to occur in his private life too. Before long, he'd meet his future wife, soulmate and lifelong muse, Gala. Soon, they'd buy a tiny fisherman's shack just over the bay here in the remote village of Port Legat, and this would be their home for the following 50 years. Over the decades, it expanded into a labyrinth of whitewashed rooms dedicated to dreams and pleasure.
Russian-born Gala was 10 years older than Dali, and when they first met in the summer of 1929, she was already married to the French surrealist poet Paul Eluard. But with Dali, it was love at first sight. and over the summer they grew ever closer, so much so that she left her husband and child to be with Dali. Gala became Dali's muse and manager. Over the years, she appeared in more than 50 of his paintings. She has been described as part tiger, part martyr, part mother, part mistress, and part banker.
This is Dali's studio. And what an amazing space. You can see immediately, look at these enormous windows just letting in all of this beautiful Portlagat light. He just had to look out the window and he'd see this view, which almost was like a ready-made painting. He just had to transcribe it on the canvas and there was a beautiful landscape. You can imagine a couple of melting watches floating there and you've got your Dali masterpiece. He always sat down in this white armchair and had the canvas arranged on this structure in front of him. And this is really, really ingenious. It actually allows Dali to move the canvas up and down through the floor so he could paint on this vast scale. And you can see all of his paints and brushes, the details so precise and was so important to him that he had to use these tools, these very, very fine sable-haired brushes to kind of get the effect.
I've come to his Sussex mansion to meet art curator Ghislaine Wood and see some of the work that he commissioned.
Hi, Ghislaine.
Hi, Alistair. Hi.
What a grand place.
It is. It's amazing, isn't it? This is the vast country house of Edward James, who was a millionaire patron of Salvador Dali and lots of other surrealist artists, actually. And he was probably the most important patron of contemporary art in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. And this was his parents' house, this vast country pile, but he didn't feel very comfortable here. So he actually moved into the hunting lodge